Good morning, everybody. This is Angie Callen, your host of No More Mondays podcast, the show where we believe you can have a thriving career or business and an amazing life on your terms. And it's my job to bring you guests who not only prove that fact, but help you work and live more authentically. For all of you listening out in podcast land, I do want to remind you that we come to you live every Monday morning via LinkedIn. So if you want this conversation as fresh as you can possibly get it, join us on LinkedIn at 10 a.m. Mountain, noon Eastern every Monday morning. And today we're tackling a biggie, everybody: perfectionism. People pleasing, fear of failure, imposter syndrome, heck, even fear of success can all be attributed to the need to be perfect. But here's a giant newsflash: no one is perfect. We are all flawed. And today you're going to hear from the guy who literally wrote the book on that fact. Greg Chasson is a PhD professor, psychologist, and award-winning author of Flawed: Why Perfectionism is a Challenge for Management. If you are sick of getting or being stuck, sabotaging your productivity, or just sick of being in your own way, this is a conversation that you need. So listen in, because Greg and I are going to rock your world when it comes to perfectionism. So Greg, welcome to No More Mondays.
Thank you for having me, and good morning.
Yes, I am. I love this topic. I feel like there's generational aspects that contribute to it. High performers fall into the perfectionism trap. And while there is good, a lot of times it holds us back more than we realize. And so I want to just kind of get right into it and use the title of the book as inspiration. Why is perfectionism such a challenge for management?
I think it's a great question to start with, because it really helps to orient people. I think most people have the assumption that perfectionism is helpful or a good trait. In fact, you see sort of the lighthearted joke around what is your greatest weakness when you go on a job interview, and everyone spins their weakness and says perfectionism because they think it's a strength. And they're not fooling anyone at this point. But the problem is that perfectionism is much more complicated than people realize. And in fact, it can be very debilitating for people, and it can cause major issues for leadership. And I think that's why this book can be so valuable, and why perfectionism needs to be a topic on people's minds, because it can really slow down productivity. It can really get in the way of a workplace. It can cause resentment. It can be a real problem.
And I think this is a very relevant conversation to some of the shifts we're seeing in the workplace today, and that movement from, or maybe let's say the demand of a movement from, what I would call the previous kind of autocratic environment that I would say perpetuated perfectionism, and into something that's a little bit more collaborative, putting people in seats where their strengths are leveraged, and hopefully backing off some of what can very much be this expectation or standard of which nobody else can reach. And I'm sure that's something that you've seen as you've been out researching and putting this book together.
Absolutely. So when I'm talking to organizations, a lot of people, a lot of leadership and employees think this is a me problem, right? That this is a self-oriented, I need to do something about this. But really, it can be a cultural issue within the teams and the organization. So perfectionism really has three major forces. One of them is self-oriented, where you develop your own high expectations that are rigid and unreasonable. Right? That's what separates it from high achievers and high expectations, is that it's rigid, inflexible, and the goals tend to be a bit unreasonable. When it's derived from within the self, it's self-oriented. When it comes from the world around you, such as perhaps the way models look on magazines, that is called socially prescribed perfectionism, where you feel like the society is pushing those rigid standards on you. But then here's the wrinkle. There's a third type that I think that you're highlighting that's called other-oriented perfectionism, where you are projecting standards that you've derived onto other people. And that can be extremely toxic. And I think we've all been in situations where people have thrusted their own ridiculously high and rigid standards on other people. And what makes it even more toxic is when that becomes about moral standards. So some perfectionism revolves around morality and being a good person. And if you're projecting moralistic standards on other people, boy, can it look self-righteous.
Judgment zone.
Yeah, exactly.
I am going to withstand a very big compulsion to go into a political discussion around that fact. However, this, I think, comes back to if you are a manager doing this, you are not serving your team in a great way.
I would say not. I don't think it's serving you or your team. And it does require a little bit of insight in taking a step back and understanding that this is a form of perfectionism, and people don't recognize that. This is a much more nuanced topic than people give credit.
And that's why I like the fact that, like, from a PhD perspective, you've like in-depth researched this. And I want to talk more about its roots. So where does perfectionism come from? What causes it? Why does it seem so prevalent in our lives right now?
The answer is that we don't entirely know. We know that there's a little bit of nurture and a little bit of nature, that they both go together in an interactive way. We know that there are generational transmission of perfectionistic tendencies, right? In other words, grandparents and parents might model perfectionistic behavior and expectations that then get sopped up like a sponge by the younger generation. We do see across generations, some work by Tom Curran has shown that that perfectionism is increasing across the generations. So we are in fact seeing something that you're describing. I do think we see it in nurture as well. A lot of cultural components, a lot of toxic achievement mentalities, a lot of, pushing our kids to do everything perfectly and to do everything comprehensively. And I think that is playing a role as well. And so where does it come from? Definitely biology plays a role. There's probably a genetic component that corresponds to a personality trait that we call neuroticism. It's really basically just an anxious disposition. And I think that is what tends to be genetic. And then that gets mixed in a negative way with some of these environmental ingredients, like a toxic achievement culture and parents and grandparents that might be modeling a certain behavior to yield, a perfectionistic state.
And then I'm going to take that even one step broader, that I would be curious to know how social media has played a role in this, especially in that socially prescribed kind of extrinsic factor of perfectionism, because we all know what we're seeing on Facebook is everybody presenting the good and never presenting the ugly. So it can give you this perception that everybody's lives are perfect. And so now we have yet another standard to meet. How have you seen that come into play?
Absolutely. I think social media is a huge platform for perpetuating perfectionism, which is hard to say. Perpetuating perfectionism.
Say that 3 times fast. Perfectly. Perpetuate. Yeah. So it's, I think that it depends on the platform, right? But Facebook is in particular, we don't tend to post things that don't look good for us. LinkedIn, as much as I love LinkedIn, not to badmouth it, but I think it's also a place where we put our best foot forward from a career standpoint. And so I think that social media is causing more of the same, if not exacerbating the issue. And what I find really interesting is, I agree, the marketing 101, you're not gonna market yourself based on the skeletons in the closet. And I'm not saying go air them necessarily on a public platform, because that could do more harm than good in various ways. But there is something to be said about vulnerability as the antidote to perfectionism.
Absolutely. So a couple of things that I think about. There was a recent movement where people in my field that were doing research and submitting grants to the NIH were posting about them not receiving the grant, or what we call not funded, which means that you were in the bottom 50%. Now, grants are funded at 5 to 10%. They are extremely challenging to get through the NIH. And it is absolutely the norm to apply for 10 grants and get maybe one if you're lucky. But nobody ever posts about the failure. So there was a recent movement that I saw on social media for people to post all of the non-funded projects. And I was just sort of feeling liberated by that. But we just don't see enough of that. This is like the no makeup pictures on Insta or on Facebook. I think that there is room for vulnerability. It's just not the main drive that we see on these platforms.
The no makeup stuff I love that a bunch of people trying to get funded for their research on perfectionism are showing the imperfections of the funding process. I love it. And we're starting to talk about a little bit of the flip side of the coin here. And that is there are redeeming qualities of perfectionism, and so we don't want to sit here and just beat this up like the printer on Office Space necessarily. What do we have to gain through some of the positives of perfectionism?
That's a great scene, by the way. Love it.
I just gave everyone a visual throwback to 1999.
Love it, and the song playing in my head.
Yep.
So yeah, there are tremendously positive qualities for people with perfectionism. I do not want this to be a witch hunt. In fact, I would think that eliminating perfectionists from your workplace is an awful idea. They bring some of the best qualities to your workplace. This includes loyalty. Tend to see a lot of loyalty. We see a lot of honesty. Remember, we talked about the moralism before. Well, that can actually have a good side to it, in that we tend to see a little bit more of an honest approach to things. Really good attention to detail. I'm a firm believer that we need teams that have complementary skills, that not just big picture thinkers, but also detail oriented masters, because we need all of this. We need people that will keep an eye on the details. There's nobody I would want on my team looking at the details more than a perfectionist, right? Whereas a big picture thinkers, maybe a perfectionist that would not be their best role. And then we have the hardest working person in the room, right? They've doubled down, tripled down on everything that they've done since they were a kid. They know how to work hard because that's how they've gotten to where they are. So they are the most industrious person that you're going to find. And lastly, the most positive trait that has a strong positive correlation with perfectionism is conscientiousness. And so I personally, if I had to pick one ingredient in a team member or somebody that I lead, it would be conscientiousness. This, the idea that someone is being thoughtful about what they're doing is so critical for productivity and innovation, and frankly, just being a good team member.
I loved how you framed the hard worker, the striver, in a positive way of industriousness. By the way, I wanted to point that out, and the conscientiousness of just like being a human that's a big platform for me right now, is be a human. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of want to connect these two pieces that we're talking about, and maybe put you on the spot of where or how do we identify or operate in the very small gray area between the positives of loyalty, honesty, attention to detail, industriousness, and consciousness, and the flip side of the coin that is overwork, burnout, imposter syndrome, people pleasing, holding people to a standard they're never going to meet. How do we straddle that?
It's a great question, and I don't know that it's the right question, because it's not a zero-sum game. In reality, you can minimize a lot of the damage and things that perfectionism causes without really sacrificing a lot of the positives. And so I think that's a good message for people to understand, is that you don't need to give up loyalty and honesty and conscientiousness if you're going to combat all the negative stuff that comes with perfectionism. So you really can have it all, right? You can be the best worker in the room, and you can keep all those good traits as well. And so I don't know that it's about finding that middle ground. It's about identifying the ways in which you're being perfectionistic. And I have ways of identifying that in the book. And it's a common thing I go over when I speak with organizations. Like, how do you identify this, both in terms of your workers and then also in terms of the people that you're trying to hire, right? And what do you look for? But in reality, you can start to do things, and there are strategies for changing the culture from the top down in the organization, as well as working from the bottom up with individuals that might struggle specifically with perfectionism, fear of failure, imposter syndrome. And so between top down and bottom up processes, you can help somebody with strategies for essentially minimizing the damage from perfectionism, and then grasping onto all the good stuff and really leveraging it.
I love what you said about this not being a zero-sum game. I'm going to equate that to the fact that there is no such thing as work-life balance. There's an equilibrium that you find, and you kind of find ways to cope or keep checks and balances of the negative in place so that the positive shine. And it sounds to me like a lot of that in this particular topic is around the mental aspect of it and the perspective that we bring to either our own perfectionism, our team's perfectionism, or our environment, right?
Absolutely. I think a lot of it is mindset. A lot of the book is about changing and shifting one's worldview. In fact, if you end my book without having a shift in the way that you see the world, not just work, I don't know that I've done my job. And the feedback I've been getting about the book, it has been very much that this has completely flipped their idea upside down of how to approach the world. It's from prioritizing and not getting stuck in process paralysis to not over focusing on rules at the expense of the underlying principles. There are ways of approaching goals and rigid thinking in a way that can loosen those using approaches that are a bit counterintuitive. I talk a lot in the book about an approach based on my world and research on exposure-based approaches to treatment, where we then apply that to the workplace, doing exposure-based exercises like making mistakes on purpose. And when I tell people that, it kind of blows their minds. Like, what do you mean make mistakes on purpose? I get making mistakes is okay, but you want me to actually make them on purpose?
Immersion therapy, everybody. Immersion therapy.
Yeah. And it's not like I'm having a heart surgeon go in and put a lung where a heart should go. But instead we start small and we work our way up. And, you might send a typo in an email. You might send this message to Jim in receivables instead of Jim in accounting, right? Or the thing that, of course, I've never done, which is forgot the attachment on an email and had to reset. Never. And so
or left something sitting in your outbox for a week, and then somebody's like, "Hey, where's the thing?" And you're like, "Oh, that thing I thought I sent a week ago." Mm-hmm.
Angie, that's embarrassing. Don't ever do that.
I know.
What a terrible mistake.
I am useless.
We all do these things, but the perfectionist catastrophizes them and sees them as all or none. This is awful. I'm a terrible person. I'm a terrible worker. And so by doing these exercises where you have them do these little things in increasingly difficult ways, right? So send a typo to your colleague. Next, once you've mastered that, let's send a typo to your boss. Then let's send it to the board of directors, right? So you could kind of build on it over time. And what they learn is that they can tolerate the mistake. They can tolerate the anxiety. It's not as catastrophic as they think it's going to be. And I think equally important, they learn that they're not going to crumble from the anxiety, right? That they're not going to decompensate.
It's a little bit of like desensitization. And as you realize that the world isn't going to crumble because, you left, a T off the end of a word. And I love where you're taking this conversation, because you said something earlier about like some of the tips in the book about how to identify perfectionism and how to start kind of attacking it. These are very small things that you can actually go try and do. And I wanted to give people some of these practical tips. So I want to go further down this path. Yep. I want to talk a little bit, maybe before we talk about more ways to start desensitizing yourself, of how to identify it. So going back to that idea that you, like in the book, you give people a framework to identify it, but probably also identify how it shows up. What are some simple ways that we could go evaluate that for ourselves?
Yeah, there are quick hacks, and then there are things that are just more core to a perfectionist presentation. The core is just inflexibility, being unable to pivot when data suggests otherwise, sticking to a plan, even if it's not working, right? And this sort of rigidity is a hallmark feature of perfectionism. And that's what separates it from high expectations. People with high expectations, they're able to feel relatively flexible and changing their perspective. If they get a 95 instead of 100 on a test, they don't feel like a failure because they see that was quote unquote good enough and they're feeling decent about it. Whereas a perfectionist is going to feel very much in an all or none rigid way that they failed and that's not good enough. And that the perfectionist really struggles to take praise and positive feedback. They might dismiss it. They might not believe it. And these are common things that you see in perfectionism, and they are red flags for perfectionists. The other thing that you can look out for are just common features like the not just right feeling. We call them NJRS or NJREs, not just right experiences. The idea that you're working at something until it feels just right and that you're not done until it feels that way. It's sort of like a threshold, a gut reaction threshold. And the problem is sometimes it never comes, or it comes way later than it should. And so the perfectionists, because of that rigidity, will keep working until they get that feeling. Whereas somebody that's not a perfectionist will say, well, it doesn't feel right, but that's okay. I'm going to stop. It's good enough. So
80-20 rule, everyone. 80-20 rule.
80-20 rule. And so you look for these kinds of things. You look for, people who might hold others to rigid standards and expectations and become a bit sanctimonious about how they approach people and things. You look for people who are overemphasizing and get stuck on the rules, even if it undermines the principle that drive those rules. And I know that's abstract, so let me give you a really stupid example. So imagine you're at a community pool. I know it's getting into wintertime, so this is a bit of a fantasy at the moment, but you're at a pool and a kid is drowning in the deep end. Nobody sees it, and you have to run to save them. But you decide that you can't run because you just ate within 30 minutes of being at the pool. And the rule on the sign says that you can't do
running.
that. But what is the underlying principle of that rule? Well, public safety. We don't want people puking in the pool, right? That's just not good for anybody. And so, but what is the problem? Well, you just tried to preserve public safety by not puking, but you let a kid drown. So basically, the public safety issue, you just threw that out the window for this poor child. And so you are overemphasizing a rule at the expense of the underlying principle that drives that rule. And I see this in a workplace setting almost constantly. People get hyper focused on these rules, and it undermines all sorts of principles and values that drive healthy workplace.
Yeah, like process it. I will take that and apply that to the workplace as process for process sake instead of process for productivity's sake. And the personality tendencies fall into one side or the other. I've definitely seen that, where some people want like a 57-step rule that every single person follows, yet the bigger picture thinkers that are maybe more creative are like in the wild, wild west. But there is a happy medium to achieve here.
There's a happy medium. And again, having multiple people on a team can help balance that out. And I would say all the extremes, as you're alluding to, can be quite problematic. And my book focuses on the people who tend to gravitate a little bit more towards the extreme side of being overly systematic and rule driven and rigid versus the wild, wild west of everything goes, nothing goes, right? And so the book is not meant for the extreme cases. I see those in my clinic at the University of Chicago, where I run a clinic, because it can get so severe that people need to come get treatment for it. But the book is actually meant for everyone sort of before that point. It's for people that lean in that direction and need some strategies and tips, and the leaders that lead them, rather than the people that need to come to my clinic. Now, of course, they're welcome to come to my clinic. And if it's that bad, I would advise people to do so. But there's a whole bandwidth of people, a whole spectrum that could benefit from some of these worldviews.
And cutting it off at the pass is to your benefit. And if you're sitting out there going, this dude has a clinic for perfectionism, you would be shocked at how this can be like the tip of an iceberg. And it can spiral all the way to very severe burnout, anxiety, depression, and mental health disorders that came from what can often be self-imposed if it's your social orientation. Or I've seen workplaces toxic workplaces create this environment for people that just holds them to a standard that psychologically they can't deal with. Don't be one of those people. If you're in a leadership position, don't be them.
It is very common, and it's something that you can work on, right? From the top down. In the book, I talk about, and there are resources on my website where you can get some language to use in things like employee handbooks and on your website, because even the way you subtly talk to people in the workplace can really set up perfectionistic expectations. Even something as simple as having a leaderboard in a sales office, right? Something like that can create perfectionistic mentalities and can create the toxic domino effect that might occur. And it's not to say that highlighting good work is bad in general, but there are things that you can do to mitigate the damage that comes from those kinds of things. So top down and bottom up. Right. And absolutely that this can get severe to the point where, let me just tell you, I didn't mention this earlier, and I want to make sure I bring it up. One of the biggest red flags or signs of perfectionism is procrastination.
Yes.
Right? Because what happens is that people push things off because they can't get it quite right, that not right feeling, or they don't even start in the first place because they're worried that they're not going to get it right. And so things get pushed off. And I have an emphasis framework that I use where I have emphasis A, emphasis B, and emphasis C. Emphasis A means to give it your all, 110%. Like what you do, Angie, for every podcast, right? 110%, you give it your all. It's amazing, as close to perfect as we can get. And then there's emphasis B, which is to just get her done. Just get it done. Good enough. It doesn't need to be beautiful. It doesn't need to be garbage. And then there's emphasis C, which is not to do it at all. And I'm agnostic to judgment on this. There's a time and place for all three.
All three. Yes.
Right? Now, there's a time and place for A, if you're planning for your wedding or you're studying for the LSATs to go to law school. You might want to emphasis A the daylights out of that. Good for you. That should be based on your values. Your values should be your guide for what to emphasis A, what to emphasis B, and what to emphasis C. There's a time and place for emphasis C. People are like, oh, what? You just ignore things? So they say, yeah, I do.
Or delegate them.
Or delegate. I never answer those survey questions, at the customer service satisfaction surveys at the end of my call.
Me neither.
Right? And it's because my values have chosen that's not where I want to spend my time. And so I've emphasis seed that. And I got to tell you, once you've made that choice and you have this framework to help you do so, it's extremely liberating. Extremely liberating.
You've given yourself permission not to have to do everything in A. I'm going to throw in a sample B. Yep. If you're an entrepreneur out there and you're putting things out into the market, that's a B, because you don't want to toil and spend that extra 20% of the time perfecting something that isn't going to be perfect anyway, because you're going to get feedback that's going to iterate it. And that's where one of the biggest traps of perfectionism I see holding kind of like business owners and entrepreneurs back, because they fear putting things out there. But I have to go back to the fact that you brought up procrastination, because a few weeks ago, I actually did a mastermind session on procrastination. And one of the guys comes in beforehand and he goes, I'm curious to see how this goes, because I am very disciplined and I don't procrastinate. But then we started talking about the reasons we procrastinate. And he was like, oh,
that's me.
Oh, I actually do this because I'm Supermaning and trying to do everything all at once. Or I want to be the expert who knows everything before I do all the things. All of them funnel down to some sort of perfectionist trait. And if you're aware of them, you can do something about it.
I agree. And I was bringing this back to procrastination because I think you can see it in this framework. What happens is that perfectionists try to emphasis A everything. They try to emphasis A everything, and there's no discerning what emphasis B tasks should be. And frankly, most things in life are best left to B, emphasis B. But people with perfectionism try to emphasis A everything. And what happens is that things turn into emphasis C as a result. They get pushed off and never done. And the problem is, it's not your values choosing emphasis C, it's your perfectionism.
Yep.
And so it really is this pattern, emphasis A to forced emphasis C, that really is procrastination. And so it's this common pattern that I think is paralyzing for people, including entrepreneurs who are trying to launch a product. I work with entrepreneurs and I see this a lot. There's this fear of failure, which is partly what perfectionism is tied to, and they're wanting to perfect something. But as you indicated, how often is the product you put out there never iterated on? I would say 0.
7 years later, mine are still being iterated on.
Right.
The ABC thing, I don't know why this just popped into my head. My dad was my high school math teacher, and he always used to say, Ange, B's are good grades. Mm-hmm. So in the ABC framework, B's are good grades. That said, I never got them. I only got A's because I was a perfectionist, but I can also tell you that you can recover from it and find the happy medium between the A, B's, and C's. Because I think without even realizing it, that's probably a framework I follow subconsciously. And so that's another good message here, is you can begin to retrain your brain. If you're intrinsically creating this environment for yourself, you can retrain your brain on how you look at external factors, and you can retrain how you interact with others if you're projecting your standards on other people. Which brings me to a tiny little thing I want to leave everyone with. I would love to give everybody a tip on how they can, one small thing they can do to improve doesn't feel like the right word, address each of the three types of perfectionism. So like a little tip if you find yourself being self-oriented, a little tip if you fall victim to the social prescribed perfectionism, and a little tip if you are projecting on others.
So for the self and the other oriented, actually, this works for all three of them. I'm happy to break it down, but I would say a very concise thing to look out for if you want the biggest bang for your buck is to look out for the should statement, the ought to, must. There's a famous psychologist, Albert Ellis, long since passed away, but he used to say, stop masturbating, M-U-S-T, right? Because
I love it.
And then there was another psychologist, Clayton Barbeau, who used to say, stop shooting all over
shooting on yourself. I've heard that one. Yeah.
Yeah. And the idea is that should statements set up these perfectionistic expectations that are rigid and excessive and all or none. And they are coming from either you or this perception of society that is not really necessarily backed up by reality. And they are by far the most common but debilitating compasses that people use to go through their day. And so if you're projecting this onto other people, you're projecting it onto yourself, or you see it being projected onto you by society, and you see it as a should statement, that should be a clue to you to take a step back and say, what are my values telling me? Where's my flexibility here? What's really important?
You don't have to wear this as a badge of honor.
No, definitely not.
And I think we oftentimes do. And so here's my summary for this episode, Greg. You ready?
I'm ready.
Stop masturbating and shooting all over yourself, and sure as hell better not do it at the same time, because you can have it all and you can leverage the positive aspects of perfectionism and keep the negatives at bay, whether you're controlling your own environment or creating an environment for everybody else. This could be a 12-hour episode, because this is a topic I love so much, because it just is, it's awareness is a really big aspect of, I would say, addressing it and improving our environments because of it. And Greg has amazing resources out there, I would say, to build awareness, identify, and start recovering from the perfectionist tendencies. So Greg, tell us where we get to learn more from you. I know you've got some exciting things coming out, so plug it all, because every single one of you listening and not listening needs it.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So the book obviously is a good place to start. www.flawedbook.com, which is a bit of a funny URL.
It's kind of an amazing URL.
Yeah. Then I have a lot of opportunities to speak to organizations. If you see a cultural issue here in your organization and teams, and you want a little bit of a shakeup and to flip that world upside down, I would love to come in and to provide that messaging and programming. And then lastly, I'm about to launch a membership community where people are going to come and try to find the balance between wellness and productivity, and perfectionism and anxiety will be a big part of that. And so come get some support. This is not a clinical thing. If you're needing clinical services, by all means, please check that out. And you can, go to the International OCD Foundation. We didn't talk about this, but perfectionism and OCD tend to go hand in hand. IOCDF.org, and look for treatment providers. They have a database there. And those people should be able to treat perfectionism that's causing real distress and impairment in terms of clinical needs. But if you're not at that level and you want some strategies, start with a book, have me come in and do some speaking, or look into my membership community. And feel free to come to my website, gregchasson.com, and reach out to me. I love hearing from people.
I love what you said about the community being we can be productive in a healthy way. And I think that really that's what this entire conversation is about, is giving people permission to do that, empowering them to do that. And then Greg's got a ton of wealth of tools to help you out. And I love the rundown of kind of like broad to specific that you provided. This has been a fantastic conversation, and I think very needed for everybody out there to hear. So I appreciate you so much for your time, sharing your knowledge, and also all the work you're doing to build the knowledge and resources around this topic, because we can be a much healthier and productive society if we start really embracing a lot of these topics. And I appreciate everything you're doing to support it.
I thank you so much for having me. I love spreading this message, as you can tell. So I'm trying to create a bit of a mini movement around it, and I appreciate
Let's do
the
it.
opportunity. Yeah, let's
We
do
have
it.
a No More Mondays movement, so I would say let's have the anti-perfectionist movement, but we need a sexier name for it because that's not perfect enough.
It is not perfect enough. I would give it a B. I would give
It's
it
a
a grade
B.
B. Yeah.
But maybe that's what it should be, because B's are good grades, everyone. Great,
Yes,
Chasson.
exactly.
Thank you so much for joining me today on No More Mondays. And again, sharing everything that you're doing to create this movement that I think is very relevant and will improve lives. And I hope all of you out there really take everything we talked about to heart. And if you had a little bit of an eyebrow raised throughout here and something struck a chord, check out Greg's book, his website, and the community he's launching, because there is help out there for recovering perfectionists like me.
Absolutely.
So if you're looking for details on the episodes, we will put the links in the comments of the LinkedIn Live and get it up on nomoremondays.info. If you want to be able to link to everything Greg mentioned, make sure you follow him on LinkedIn, follow Mila on LinkedIn. If you're listening to this in Podcast Nation, leave us a review because Greg and I are amazing. And until next week, everybody, I hope you have a great week. Keep perfectionism at bay. See, I didn't even say it perfectly. And I will see you all next week for another edition of No More Mondays podcast.